get lost, they make a wrong turn. But this is a Google Earth photo of this entire area. And you can see the front door of the house points in the same direction as the arrow. If my father went to the right, he would go right up here, a quarter of a mile, to where he'd escaped. Well, he's not going that way, because that way is a major road. And it's nighttime, he could probably hear the road, he could probably see the road. There was nowhere near as many houses as there are today. He's not going to the right, so he went left. If he went left, there's a fork in the road right here. And I know, because I've seen it, if he got to the fork and he went left again, there's a couple of barns there. But if he got to the fork and he went right, this is what he sees. Nothing but field. Now remember, it's wartime. I know that it was cloudy that night because I looked at records. There's a blackout, there is no light, you can't see the moon, you can't see anything. He's lost as can be. And if he looks forward, all he sees is fields. And he turned around and he couldn't find his way back, but he found the stream. It happens, it's this, if you see this line, it's actually bushes, but the bushes cover a little stream. And my father spent a week by that stream with his 8 potatoes. And after a week, the family dog found him. And he was only, in the end, 200 yards from the house. But because it was wartime, because it was rainy most of the week, because he was hiding himself, no one found him until the dog found him a week later. And he was still barely alive, but he was alive. And this time they took him, and they took him to a barn right next to their house. And they kept him there for another week till the Americans came through. And the Americans came through, and my father survived. So I told you I wrote a book. I want to tell you why I wrote the book and sort of what journey I've gone on, and then I'll take questions from you guys. So in 2007, I have a cousin who lives in Israel. She's exactly my age. Her mother is one of the surviving brothers and sisters in my father's family. She calls me up. My father died in 2001, so this is 6 years after my father had passed on. And she says, "You're never going to believe this. Your father's on the internet." My father didn't even own a laptop. She goes, "Your father's on the internet. Go Google him." And I Googled David Hersch in Whitehausen, and this photo comes up, the one I showed you earlier. I don't have this picture. I don't know how they got this picture. And under the picture is a caption. It says, "The Friedman family found my father emaciated and near death and rescued him, and he survived the war." How did they get the picture? And how did they know his story? So I wrote in Whitehausen, I said, "I'm Dave Hersch's son. I know the story. How do you know the story?" And we started talking back and forth. We were emailing back and forth, and I learned what they learned. What I learned was this. So I said he'd been in a hospital for 18 months. After he was in the hospital, he took a train back to his hometown in Hungary, a town called Dej. It happened that the train stopped in Enns. The reason it stopped in Enns is because after World War II, Russia and the United States and England divided up a lot of the German and Austrian country into 4 zones. The separation between the Russian zone and the American zone was exactly this town. So every train had to stop, they had to show passports and that kind of thing. They stopped there for 4 hours. While they were there, my father said to this, no one had telephones. My father said to the station master, "You know, the people who saved my life live in this town. Can you ask them to come and meet me at the train station? I want to say thank you." And they did. And when they came, well, actually the husband came, the wife didn't come. When the husband came, my father not only said thank you, here I am looking like I normally look, like not like a 75 or 80 pound skeletal figure. He gave him the photo. Now, how did my father get the photo? He didn't go into concentration camp with the photo. I don't know the exact story, but what I think happened was that when my father started to feel better in the hospital, he wrote home. He didn't know who was alive and who was dead. He wrote home to the Jewish community of Dej, and he said, "I'm alive. Is anybody else alive?" And they got the letter to the 2 other brothers and sisters that were alive. And they started writing back to each other. Of course, you can't imagine how happy they were. But they were writing back and forth, and the brothers and sisters sent them a photo of them. And then my father said, because my father was a good-looking guy, or as I would tell people, my father was good-looking, just ask him. My father was a good-looking guy, and he said, "Can you do me a favor, send me a couple copies of the picture?" Who knows why he needed it. He had a couple of copies of the picture on him, and he gave it to his family. And 20 years later, a historian was doing work on the history of Austrian resistance against the Nazis in World War II. Now, a form of resistance is hiding prisoners. So what this guy decided to do was walk the Death March route and talk to every single family he could to find out if anybody helped escapees. And what he discovered was 2 other stories. They both died as soon as they escaped, because you know, you were near death on the march, and they discovered this family. This guy discovered this family. And he wrote about them, and they told the story that they knew about the second escape. My father never told them about the first escape. And they gave the guy the photo. The guy never put, his name was I'm actually blanking on his name. But anyway, but he never actually published a book. He was going to do that. And instead of publishing a book, when he died, his family gave it to Mudhausen. And then Mudhausen, a few years later, when the internet was discovered or invented, and they created a website, they put the story on the website. And then my cousin found it in 2007. So that's the story of my father. That's the story of why I wrote the book. That's my story. Questions from you guys? We have about 20 minutes. I can take all the questions you got. Go ahead.
Okay, so you said when they met that couple, they were hiding SS soldiers in the Berlin area?
Yes.
Why are they hiding SS soldiers?
So they weren't hiding SS soldiers in the second floor. So the question is, I said something about hiding SS soldiers in the second floor. Why were they hiding soldiers? It wasn't that they were hiding soldiers. So remember when I was describing my father in his hometown, that in 1943, they were ordered to put up German soldiers in their home, 4 German soldiers. Well, it also in Austria, as the fighting got closer, because they had nowhere to put the soldiers, families in the area were ordered to put up SS troops. So this guy, Mr. Ignaz Friedman, put up, I don't know how many SS troops, but he had empty rooms upstairs. And he put the SS troops in his upstairs. And they were living there, so they would go out and do whatever soldiers do when they're not actually fighting during the day, and they'd come back and live there at night. And every time they came back at night and went upstairs, my father was downstairs. Yes, in the back.
Did the family find out if your father was Jewish?
That's a super question. So did the family ever find out my father was Jewish? My father insists that when they rescued him, and until he told them, when at the end of the war, when the war was over, and the husband and wife said, the war is over, you're free to go, my father said, I have to tell you something. I'm actually a Jew. And they said, that's okay, you know, we would have rescued you no matter what. But later, when the husband and wife were interviewed for the story 20 years later, they insisted they always knew he was a Jew because they knew that only Jews were on the death marches. And because they rescued someone from the death march, even though my dad said he was Czechoslovakian, they say that they believed that he was Jewish that they knew he was Jewish from the start. I don't really know the truth. I tend to believe that if they didn't know at first, they eventually figured it out for the reason that only Jews were on these marches through the town, but I don't really know. That's a really great question. More questions? Yeah.
Why did he say he was from Czechoslovakia?
You know, I don't know. I think my father said the first thing that came to his mind. He spoke Czech. He probably could tell you where Prague was, but that's it. And he spoke Czech because there were other Czechoslovakian prisoners. And my father had a ridiculous ear for languages. He could hear a language and start communicating it within days. So I think he just picked Czechoslovakia because it's the first thing that popped into his head. And he couldn't say he was German. He didn't want to say he was Jewish. And he knew Czechoslovakia was not far because he knew other Czechoslovakian prisoners. He just picked it. And it turns out that they did not have family in Czechoslovakia. They said, remember the wife said, oh, we have plenty of family in Czechoslovakia. Are you hungry? Turns out they didn't. The concentration camp did a huge amount of work to learn who these people were. They died soon after the war. They had one son. He died soon after, not long after. He was 11 years old at the time and never knew my dad was in the house. But they have grandchildren, a grandson and a granddaughter, and I met them both, and they knew the story about my dad. But they all insist no one was from Czechoslovakia, which raises the question: if they weren't from Czechoslovakia, why did they save my dad? And the answer was, it turns out, from what digging I could do, they saved them because they did the right thing. They were just good people, and they were confronted with this emaciated guy who was clearly hungry, who clearly needed help. And they did the right thing. Questions? Yeah. So, a couple of easy ones. He lived in Hungary, but this town was Hungarian until 1918. And from 1918 to 1940, it was Romanian. And then it switched back to Hungary during the war, and then back to Romania till today. So he spoke Hungarian, because most people did in the town, and he spoke Romanian because the Romanians required it. He spoke Yiddish because Yiddish is a language, it's kind of German-like. It's a language that many European Jews spoke, and Yiddish is still kind of spoken a little bit today. You ever heard the word schlepp? You guys know what schlepp is? Schlepp's a Yiddish word. There's lots of words. You know what, you ever heard of chutzpah? Words like that are actually Yiddish words that have just made it into the American lexicon, English lexicon. So he spoke Yiddish. Because he spoke Yiddish, he spoke German. He learned Polish and Czechoslovakian in the camps. He spoke, there's another one, here's a good one. A little bit of Russian. He spoke Spanish fluently because there were many Spanish prisoners in the camp. And then he used to say, then he learned English, which was 9. And he used to say that he also spoke Greek, because if he heard a language and he couldn't understand it, it was Greek to him. No, that's the funniest thing I'm going to say. All right, was there a question? Yes? So, okay, the question was, why would they allow my dad to go into a hospital? Why bother helping him? I mean, they're trying to work him to death. What's the point? That's something that I found a quandary ever since my father started telling us. Like, why did there actually, not only was there this revere, this infirmary, there was even a hospital. It turns out, here's the answer why. So in these concentration camps, there were various levels of work you had to do. Sometimes all you're doing were loading boxes. And you know what? You don't really need a college education to load boxes. And by the way, my father stopped going to school in 5th grade, which you know sounds really interesting, and maybe I'd like to do that too. But he stopped in 5th grade, and that's just what they did back then. But it turns out that this concentration camp also had factories. Some of the factories made airplane parts. And remember, it was a rock mine, and sometimes we used there was a stone crusher where my dad worked. You crushed stone into little pebbles to use in roadbeds. Now, you need no skill to operate a piece of machinery that crushes stone. But they also made stone facades for buildings, you know, beautiful decorative fronts of buildings. And you need to be an artisan to do that. Well, if you're an artisan, you're skilled. You can make airplanes, or you can make beautiful stone, you know, sculpture stone. And you get sick, and they're feeding you next to nothing, so you're gonna get sick. But they need you. So they can feed you to within an inch of your life, but they don't want you to die. So if you got into real medical trouble, they wanted you better. And so they had this infirmary, and they had even a hospital just in case. But it turned out that most of the time, they kind of really didn't care. I don't know the answer to the question, why did my father manage to spend 3 months in this hospital? He had boils, he had typhus, he had peritonitis. Why didn't they kill him? I will never know the answer. There's some conjectures to the answer. The thought is, my father was an interesting, engaging guy. He was a funny guy. He could tell jokes in all 9 of those languages. And so, okay, this is a concentration camp, and everything you read and hear about concentration camps is that it is a worst place in the world to be. But you know what? At the end of the day, the prisoners and the capos, who were captains in charge of prisoners, and the guards, they're humans. And if they see a guy who's funny and interesting and speaks their language, maybe they just like him a little better, and maybe they get along with him, and maybe when they're picking out people to kill because they can't work anymore, they go, yeah, Dave, you're good. Oh, you're good, right? I mean, we all encounter examples of where our personality makes a difference for us. Usually that difference is I'm not going to have to pay the bus fare, or I'm not going to have to do this extra homework. In his case, the difference was life or death, and it worked every single time for him. Yeah. Wait, I'm losing you. Say it again. Okay, so the question is, when my father's finally was rescued by the Americans, was he reunited with his siblings? So he spent 18 months in a hospital first. The hospital was in Passau, Germany. It was actually 50 miles further away from Hungary. And then after 18 months, after recovering, first thing he had to do is he had to gain 75, 80 pounds back. And then he had to get over pneumonia, and he had tuberculosis, and he had typhus, and he got peritonitis, which is something you get which infects your stomach, and affected him for his entire life afterward. Once he recovered from all of those things, He had written to his family in February, so almost a year. They rescued him in May, but the next February he wrote back to the hometown saying, "I'm alive, is anybody alive?" And then in October of that year, after learning that he had two brothers and sisters that survived, in October he took the train back home. And he said, yes, they were reunited. And then eventually, they all left. My father left for Israel in 1947, and the other two brothers and sisters eventually went to Israel over the next 10 years. And they all went to a town near Tel Aviv. And there were actually only one uncle is alive today, but so they all lived there. My cousin lives there. My cousin called me, lives in Italian. More questions? Yes.
So I know that like the Holocaust is like a really bad thing. Did your father have like any mental health issues?
So, did my father have any mental health issues? And so, there's lots of ways to characterize a mental health issue. Like, for instance, PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. You can't go through what my father went through and not have symptoms of some sort or another. You just can't. Now, another reason I wrote the book, another reason I like to talk about my dad is when you hear about survivors, not only did I tell you that, okay, some of these guys are 80 and 90 and 95 years old, or maybe you can think of them just as skeletal figures, but also, the most famous of them don't crack a smile. They don't tell a joke. They're as morose and as somber as can be. Look, to describe this as a serious topic is understating it. You can't be more serious than having been in a concentration camp. And most of the people who got out of concentration camps don't talk about it, are traumatized by it for their entire lives. Some people, I have friends who didn't know their parents were in concentration camps until after they died. Now, why wouldn't I know this? It's my dad. So in my father's case, he was a funny, interesting, gregarious, life-of-the-party guy as long as I knew him. And when he told the story, he would tell it in a kind of funny way. There's nothing funny about my father's 11 months in a concentration camp, and yet he told it in an interesting, engaging, and funny way. And that alone is an example of what mental health issue he had. The way he dealt with it was to think of it kind of in loose terms, in funny terms, and it wasn't so bad. Yes, it was. But that's how he dealt with it. And he left out the worst of it. And when I walked the grounds of the concentration camp, when I got to that intersection and I realized what it must have taken to make that turn, I realized how much he was keeping in his back pocket. And so that's how he dealt with it, is he talked about it. But yes, he used to talk about nights where he couldn't sleep every once in a while, all because of that. Yeah?
During the second death march, how many miles did he get before he escaped?
So the first step, how far did my father go before escaping the second time? So I don't know exactly, I do know exactly now, but the way I discovered where he escaped was I knew he talked about how he got to the same first intersection, which was 6 miles, and he was really, really bummed out about the fact that he couldn't escape again. And he thought that was the last, a week earlier, that was the last chance I have to live. And he kept going, and it was drizzling out, and it was cold out, and he never said how far he went. He said, I went a little bit further, and I went to the side of the road. But remember, he went to the side of the road. I was a little bit of a detective in writing this book. And when he went to the side of the road, he talked about how he went and ran into bushes and trees. Well, on the route, I figured because of the way he talked, he only went a mile or two. On the route for the next 2 miles, there was only 2 places where there were bushes and trees. One of them, right behind the bushes and trees, were a couple of apartment buildings. He's not running there. But the next one was where the photo I showed you. It was between a bridge and 15 feet away a wall. It wasn't a wall during the war, it was barbed wire. And right there were bushes and trees. It's 1.25 miles from the first place, which fits perfectly. And here's the interesting thing. If my father had gone to the side of the road 5 feet earlier or later, 5 feet earlier, it would have been the barbed wire. 5 feet later, he wouldn't have seen the path. I wouldn't be here. So when I stood there a few years ago, I realized, because I stood within inches of where my father went to the side of the road, sat down, had a gun put in the back of his neck. Right? And I want to just digress for a second. So I'm talking about my dad's story, right? Part of what I hope people would get out of my book, part of what I hope you guys get out of, your parents all have stories. It doesn't matter what your parents do. If they're a CEO, if they're a call center operator, if they're a homemaker, whatever your parents do, they have stories. And those stories affect who you are. Whether you know it now, whether you love your parents or aren't sure you really like them that much right now, no matter what it is, Your parents and the way they are and the stories they have that made them who they are, make you who you are. So if not now, at some point, keep in your back pocket the idea that you want to learn the stories. Don't just learn the stories the way they tell it. Dig and ask questions. Because when my father told the story, every Seder for my life, I never asked hard questions. And now I wish I did. You have a question or you just want it? Questions? Yeah.
You said the family dog found us.
Yes.
Was that dog looking for him?
So it was raining a whole week. Their house was 200 yards away. I don't know why the dog, it was a little, my dad describes it as a little dog. So this was not like a German Shepherd. I don't know what it was, but my dad, for the prior 48 hours, couldn't move. He was done. He was toast. The potatoes had run out. Okay, fine. He had 3 days of decent meals, but now he's out in the rain, in the cold. He's got a blanket, he's got a jacket, but it's raining, and he's outdoors. He's gone. And so I don't know why the dog was out that day, but apparently my dad does say it rained the entire week. And he was actually in a place where, when I found it, it's got a little bit of like natural shelter overhead, so it probably wasn't really raining hard on him. But the dog was just out roaming around and starts yapping wildly that, and of course the wife comes along and says, why is my dog yapping? And she finds my dad. Yeah.
So after the second time your dad escaped, like, did the Germans sort of like one?
No. I remember he's gone, so I don't know what the Germans thought. But the German soldiers never saw him escape. No one saw him escape. And the presumption, I would think, on their part, was that because guys would just go to the side of the road and drop dead, because they're 7 miles into a 34-mile march, they haven't had any real food in months or years, and some people just went to the side of the road and died. You didn't have to get shot. You just expired. And so my guess is they presumed he just expired, because it wouldn't occur to them to look for him. But that's a great question, though.
For all those people like the death marches, did they like keep record if they died or not?
There were no records. And not only that, great question about records. So in theory, the Germans were known as great record keepers, but not towards the end of the war. First of all, they completely stopped by the time they got to April. But there are records, like my father had a brother-in-law who was with him in the camps, who was killed within days of getting to Gusen. They forced him to move a 2,000-pound rock by himself. And you can't move a 2,000. It's like moving a car. And they beat him to death because he couldn't move it. And my father said it happened within days of getting there. My father got there on June 13th. So by June 20th, my uncle was dead. There's a record of my uncle's death, and it says February 1st or 2nd, 1945. Wrong. So they purposely, and I've read about them purposely making up reasons for death as, escape, shot while trying to escape, that kind of thing, to prisoners, just to try to cover up what they were really doing, which is killing people just for the sake of killing them. Yeah? How many languages do I speak? I speak 3. Greek, like I told you, because if I don't understand it, it's Greek. English, and I speak Hebrew fluently too. And I know the word Meshuggah, which is Yiddish, so I know a little Yiddish. Yes? So my father, that's a super question. My father had a guy, a friend of his from his hometown, that I have a photograph of before the war. His name was Yitzhak Moses. Yitzhak Moses was with my father from the second day in Auschwitz all the way to the first death march when my father escaped. Toward a month before the death march, Yitzhak Moses' brother, Chaim, joined them. He was in a labor battalion. He was a big, strapping guy, and they'd been feeding him pretty well. Chaim survived the war. Yitzhak, who my father spent every day with, died after that. He survived the death march, and he died in that camp where they were going to with the barbed wire, with no food and no shelter and no sanitary and nothing. He died there. That's the only guy my father had with him. Many years later, when I was growing up, and I went to temple regularly, there was a guy in my temple. His son was my age. We went to school together. This guy, my father and he got friendly, and it turned out he was in Gusen in an adjacent barracks to my father at the same time. And they each are the only known survivors that they know of from Gusen. My father would talk about occasionally the people he met in the camps, and he would tell them, and they're all dead. They all died then. And he would tell it in sort of a cold way. He just got used to the fact that life was ephemeral. Life was, fleeting for these people. Questions? More questions? Yes.
When did your dad meet your mom, and did she also, was she Jewish?
So my mother was Israeli. In fact, a sixth generation Israeli. She, at the age of 3, she went to England with her parents. Lived there till she was 20. She spoke English fluently with a British accent. She became a teacher and went back to Israel at the age of 20 to teach there and join the Air Force. My father, in 1947, went to Israel. And in 1950, my father and a couple of his buddies, a few of his buddies, 4 of them, decided they wanted to learn English. And they met my mom. And my mom was an English teacher. So my mom agreed to teach these 4 guys English, sort of on the side. And then my dad got the teacher. So, yeah. Which would be what my dad would do. He got away with everything. Any more questions? Time for 1 or 2 more questions? Good? Yes?
What did your father end up doing, child life after he married and he went from Israel to
So well, my dad really couldn't earn a living in Israel. When he came to this country, he started as a busboy in a hotel that was just for senior citizens. Today there's a name for it, it's called assisted living. But back then, I lived in Long Beach on the South Shore of Long Island in New York. And there were hotels there where if you were really old and couldn't work or didn't work anymore and wanted to really just retire and live in a sort of a residential hotel, there were a number of them in this town. My father started as a busboy, then became a waiter, then became a manager, and worked his way up and bought one. And that was his career. That's what put me through college. Yes?
Do you have any aspirations as a kid
Did I have an aspiration to go there?
no,
Did my father want to go back there?
yeah, so like aspirations as in like decide to working his way up for this account. Do you have any
Okay. So what else? Did my father want to do something else? Like, well, so no, my father had a 5th grade education, because that's all anybody had. And they really didn't have those kinds of options available. They weren't thinking engineers and scientists and doctors and lawyers. It just kind of wasn't where my father's head was at. My father loved to read. I imagine he could have maybe done anything, but I've never heard this question before. It's a fantastic question. I don't know what my dad's aspirations might have been. He never talked about it. I never asked him. He always talked about how he wished for me and my brother that we don't go into the senior citizen home business, that we get an education, we find something else to do besides being around very old people all day, every day. I don't know. I got to really think about that question. It's a great one.
All right, let's give